He looked at me like a stain on his expensive vest, not to be understood, but to be erased. Amidst the crystal and million-dollar handshakes, he switched to an ancient language, certain I would stay silent. I waited just long enough for the room to look down on me one last time. Then I replied in the exact language he used to humiliate me, doing it in a way that made everyone stop breathing. My name is Winna Clearfield, and I was standing in the center of the Meridian Room at the Brackenwell House when I realized I was being erased. It was not a violent erasure. It was not the sort of dramatic ejection you see in movies where security guards drag a screaming woman out by her elbows. This was a Georgetown erasure, which meant it was done with soft lighting, crystal stemware, and a silence so heavy it felt like water filling my lungs. Gideon Vale, the man who owned the room, the man who owned the evening, and the man who effectively owned my family, looked at me. He did not look at me the way a future brother-in-law looks at a family member. He looked at me the way a museum curator looks at a smudge on a glass display case. I was an obstruction to the view. I was something that needed to be wiped away so the real treasure could shine. The room was filled with the kind of people whose net worth could purchase small island nations. The air smelled of expensive perfume, old money, and the metallic tang of ambition. I stood there, holding an empty tray that someone had thrust into my hands a moment before, freezing in the spotlight of Gideon's attention. He was standing with a group of investors from Zurich and Geneva, men who wore suits cut so sharply they could bleed you if you brushed against them. Gideon smiled. It was a terrifying expression because it did not reach his eyes. His eyes remained flat and gray, like slate under a winter river. He turned slightly, angling his body away from me but keeping his gaze pinned to my face, and he spoke. He did not speak English. He did not speak standard French. He switched, effortlessly, and with a theatrical flair designed to captivate his audience, into Anglo-Norman. It was an archaic choice. It was the language of the conquerors who had crossed the Channel to rule over England nearly 1,000 years ago. It was a language of law, of administration, and of absolute, crushing authority. It was a language dead to everyone in the room except for the very few who made it their business to study the history of power. He commanded me to move. He told me, using a grammatical structure reserved for addressing serfs in the 12th century, that I was blocking the light and that I should make myself useful by vanishing. The investors from Zurich chuckled. They were European elites. They likely had a passing familiarity with Old French, or perhaps just recognized the tone of dismissal. The Americans in the circle, the politicians and the tech moguls, had no idea what Gideon had said, but they saw the Europeans laugh. So they laughed too. They laughed because in a room like this, silence was an admission of ignorance, and ignorance was the one sin that could not be forgiven. I felt the laughter physically. It hit my skin like sleet. I stood perfectly still. I did not apologize. I did not lower my head. I did not flush crimson, though my blood was hammering against my ribs with the force of a trapped bird. I kept my chin parallel to the floor, my eyes locked on the knot of Gideon's silk tie. They were weighing me. I could feel it happening. It was a systematic inventory of my worth, conducted in under 5 seconds by 50 pairs of eyes. They looked at my shoes. They were sensible black pumps, purchased on sale at a department store 3 years ago, polished carefully before I left the house, but the leather was beginning to crack at the toe. They were not Louboutins. They did not have the red sole that signaled membership in the tribe. They looked at my bag. It was functional. It held my notebook, my pens, and my phone. It did not cost $5,000. It did not have a designer logo stamped in gold leaf across the front. They looked at my hands. My left hand was clutching the silver tray. My ring finger bore a simple gold band, thin and unadorned. There was no diamond. There was no rock the size of a quail egg to catch the light and blinding the viewer to my flaws. In this room, I was not a person. I was a sum of negative integers. I was the sister who didn't marry money. I was the academic failure. I was the cautionary tale standing next to the golden couple. Gideon turned back to his guests, dismissing me without checking to see if I had obeyed. He knew I would. He assumed I was too stupid to understand the insult and too weak to challenge the tone. He said something else in that archaic tongue, a jest about the quality of the help in America, and the laughter rippled out again, louder this time. But I heard him. I heard every syllable. I heard the nasal vowels of the dialect. I heard the specific conjugation of the verb he used to describe me, a verb that implied I was not just a servant, but a parasite. I realized then that Gideon was not just being cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was performing. He was closing a deal. I saw the way the oldest man in the group, a silver-haired shark named Lucien Beaumont, was watching him. This was a test of dominance. Gideon was showing them that he could command his environment, that even his family members were subject to his whim, and that he possessed a sophisticated, historical intellect that elevated him above the common billionaire. He was using me as a prop. I was the footstool he was stepping on to reach the top shelf. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the silver tray onto the marble floor and shatter the polite jazz music that was trying to smother the tension. But I didn't. I held my breath. I let the silence stretch. I let them underestimate me. I let them think I was exactly what Gideon said I was. Because I saw something else, at the very edge of the room. Standing in the shadow of a massive velvet curtain was my husband. Dominic Coldbrook looked like he was in physical pain. He was wearing his best suit, the charcoal one we had bought for a wedding 4 years ago, and he looked handsome, but terrified. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. He was watching Gideon humiliate me. He was watching the room laugh at me. And he did not move. He did not step forward. He did not cross the room to take the tray from my hands. He did not shout at Gideon to watch his mouth. He stood there, anchored by invisible chains, his eyes wide with a mixture of shame and panic. I looked at him, and for a second, our eyes met across the expanse of the ballroom. I saw the apology there. I saw the helplessness. And I saw the fear. That was when the cold settled into my bones. It was colder than the air conditioning, colder than the champagne on ice. It was the cold realization that no one was coming to save me. Not my husband, not my sister, who was shimmering in white silk on the other side of the room. Pretending not to see, not my mother, who was likely near the buffet, nervously adjusting her necklace. I was alone. To understand why I stood there and took it. To understand why I let the laughter wash over me without flinching. And to understand why. Later that night, I would finally open my mouth and burn the room down. You have to understand what I had already lost. You have to understand the debt. You have to go back to the moment before I walked through the doors of the Brackenwell house. The evening had started with a sense of foreboding that I could not shake. We had arrived in a borrowed car because our sedan was in the shop again. Dominic had been quiet on the drive over, his fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on the steering wheel. He had told me it was just work stress. He had told me the accounts were messy at the firm, but Dominic was a terrible liar. We parked 2 blocks away to avoid the valet charge. Walking through the humid Georgetown air toward the unmarked entrance of the club, I stopped on the sidewalk to adjust the strap of my shoe. And my phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out, expecting a text from my mother asking where we were. It was not from my mother. The number was blocked. The message was short. It glowed on the screen. Stark white letters against the black background. Do not let him pick the stage. He will try to make you stand in the wrong place. I had stared at the message, the humidity curling the loose strands of my hair. I looked up at the imposing brick facade of the club. It looked like a fortress. It looked like a place where secrets went to be buried in shallow graves of money and influence. Dominic had called my name from a few steps ahead. "When are you okay?" "I'm fine," I had said, sliding the phone back into my bag. I lied. I wasn't fine. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I didn't know the shape of it yet. Now, standing in the center of the room with Gideon's ancient insults ringing in my ears, I understood the text. He had picked the stage. He had chosen a room where money was the only language spoken. He had placed me in the center, empty-handed and defenseless. He had tried to make me stand in the wrong place, the place of the victim. the place of the fool. He thought he had won. He thought the silence in the room was his victory. But silence is a funny thing. It is not empty. It is full of answers waiting to be heard. And as I looked at Gideon, at his smug jawline and his perfect, predatory smile, I realized something that the text message had tried to warn me about. He had picked the stage, yes, but he had forgotten to check if the microphone was on. And he had certainly forgotten that before I was the poor sister, before I was the invisible wife, I was something else entirely. I was a scholar of the very thing he was using to beat me. I gripped the silver tray tighter. I did not retreat. I watched him turn back to his guests, secure in his triumph. My turn was coming, and unlike him, I would not need to shout to be heard. I would not need to pretend. I looked at Dominic one last time. He looked away, unable to bear the weight of my gaze. That hurt more than the Anglo-Norman slurs. That was the cut that bled. The text message had been right. I was standing in the wrong place, but I was about to move. To understand the silence I held in that ballroom, you have to understand the noise of the life I lived outside of it. I was 34 years old. I lived in a row house in Baltimore that smelled faintly of old brick and damp rain. A solid 45-minute drive from the gilded cages of Georgetown. My life with Dominic Coldbrook was what you might call a masterpiece of adequacy. It was clean enough to exist, but not bright enough for anyone to remember. We paid our taxes. We separated our recycling. We ate takeout on Friday nights and discussed the weather with a fervor that suggested we were afraid to talk about anything else. Our apartment was the physical manifestation of my stalled potential. It was not decorated with art or expensive vases. It was insulated with paper. There were stacks of books that climbed the walls like ivy. They were not the sort of books one displays to impress guests. They were dense, dusty tomes with titles like The Evolution of Anglo-Norman Syntax in 12th Century Chancery Courts and the Semantic Shift of Feudal Obligation. My desk, a scratched oak behemoth I had salvaged from a university surplus sale, was buried under layers of photocopied manuscripts and yellow legal pads filled with my handwriting. To the outside world, specifically to the circle my sister Maris was about to marry into, I was a boring bureaucrat. I worked as a senior analyst for the Hawthorne Ridge Integrity Bureau. It was a fictional-sounding name for a very real, very dry agency that contracted with corporate legal teams to audit the linguistic precision of legacy contracts. It paid the bills, it provided dental insurance, it was respectable, but it was not powerful, in the eyes of the Vales, and truthfully, in the eyes of my own mother lately. My job was a placeholder. It was seen as a cute little administrative role that kept me busy while the real players moved the world. They did not know that my job involved dissecting the anatomy of lies. They did not know that I spent 8 hours a day hunting for the single misplaced comma or the ambiguous verb that could cost a company $50 million. Dominic respected it, or at least, he used to. Dominic was the kind of man who measured the world in concrete terms. He was an architect who had moved into project management when the design work dried up. He was calm. He was the person you wanted in the room when a pipe burst or a tire went flat. He had a deep, simmering hatred for the kind of people we were going to see tonight. The kind of people who, as he often said, used money to grind other people into paste. But lately, the grinding was happening to us. The air in our apartment had changed over the last 6 months. The easy silence of our marriage had been replaced by a static tension. It was the pressure of money, or the lack of it. We were not poor, but we were fragile. One bad month, one medical emergency, one transmission failure, and the delicate ecosystem of our solvency would collapse. I could see it wearing Dominic down. I saw it in the way he stared at the ceiling at 2 a.m. I saw it in the way he checked his bank balance on his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as if afraid to refresh the page. I stood in the bedroom, staring at the dress my mother had chosen for me. It was hanging on the back of the door, a sheath of beige silk that looked like it had been designed to blend into wallpaper. My mother had approved it via FaceTime 3 days ago. "It is elegant, Winna," she had said. her voice tight with the anxiety that always preceded a veil event. "It is respectful. Do not wear red. Do not wear black. This is Maris's night. We are the supporting cast. We need to look like we belong, but we must not look like we are competing." I touched the fabric. It felt cold. I stripped off my work clothes, a pair of yoga pants and a sweatshirt stained with ink, and began the transformation. This was the ritual. I had to shed the skin of the scholar, the analyst, the woman who could read a 300-year-old court summons in its original dialect, and put on the skin of the invisible sister. I had not always been invisible. 10 years ago, I was the one with the spotlight. I was in Paris. I had a fellowship waiting for me at a prestigious institute in Lyon. I was going to be the youngest doctorate in my field, mapping the linguistic history of power in medieval Europe. I was brilliant. I was arrogant. I was free. Then came the phone call. It was Maris. She was 22 then, weeping so hard she was choking on her own breath. She had gotten into something. She was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble you can fix with a hug, but the kind of trouble that requires lawyers and hush money and a sister who is willing to drop everything to fly home and catch the falling pieces. I came home. I never went back. I looked at myself in the mirror. The beige dress washed me out, making my skin look pale and my eyes look tired. Perfect. I was a ghost. I walked over to my desk and picked up the one thing I refused to leave behind, my notebook. It was a small, leather-bound moleskin, beaten and scarred from years of use. It fit perfectly into the clutch bag my mother had also approved. Dominic walked into the room. He was already dressed in his charcoal suit. He looked handsome, but strained. He was adjusting his cufflinks, his movements jerky and frustrated. "Here," I said softly. I walked over and batted his hands away, threading the metal stud through the fabric myself. He looked down at me. His eyes were dark, rimmed with red from lack of sleep. "I hate these people," he whispered. It was a refrain he used often, but tonight it sounded different. It sounded desperate. "It is just one night," I said, reciting the lines I had rehearsed. "We go. We eat the tiny food. We smile at the jokes we do not understand. We congratulate Maris. We come home." "Yeah," he said. He looked away, staring at the bookshelf over my shoulder. "We come home." His phone buzzed on the dresser. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Dominic flinched. It was a small reaction, a tightening of the jaw, a widening of the eyes. But I saw it. He snatched the phone up before the second ring. He looked at the screen and his face went blank. It was the blankness of a man pulling down a shutter. "I have to take this," he said. His voice was too high. "It is the office. Some issue with the permits for the downtown site." Now I asked, "It is 7 o'clock on a Friday." "You know how it is," he said, turning his back to me. "I will be right out. Just finish getting ready." He walked into the hallway and closed the door. I stood there, fully dressed in my beige camouflage, and listened. I could not hear the words, but I could hear the tone. It was not the tone of a project manager arguing about permits. It was the tone of a man begging. It was a hushed, frantic whisper that rose and fell like a fever chart. I opened my clutch and slid the notebook inside. I have always carried it. It is a habit from my days in the archives. You never know when you will find a fragment of truth in a pile of dust. I used to write down translations, etymologies, the way a word shifted meaning over 500 years from protection to prison. Now, I mostly used it to remind myself of who I was. Language is power. I had written on the first page years ago, and power always likes to pretend it is polite. Dominic came back into the room 5 minutes later. He looked pale. There was a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said. "Just paperwork. Bureaucracy. Let us go. We do not want to be late." He offered me his arm, but he did not look at me. He looked through me. We drove to Georgetown in silence. The city fell away, replaced by the manicured lawns and high iron fences of the elite district. I watched the houses get bigger, the cars get sleeker, and the lights get colder. My internal monologue was a steady drumbeat of instructions. Arrive, smile, stand in the back, do not engage, leave. It was a simple plan. It was the same plan I had executed at the engagement party, the bridal shower, and the rehearsal dinner. I was good at it. I was the blurry figure in the background of all the photos. But as we pulled up to the curb 2 blocks away from the Brackenwell house, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. It was not nausea. It was the specific, sharp instinct I used to get in the archives when I realized a document was a forgery. Something was off. It was in the way Dominic's hand shook as he put the car in park. It was in the desperate tightness of my mother's text messages asking our ETA. It was in the air itself. I looked at my husband. Dominic. I said, "If there is something you need to tell me." He unbuckled his seatbelt and forced a smile that looked like a grimace. Nothing. Winna, truly, let us just get through this. He got out of the car. I sat there for a second longer, gripping my clutch, the notebook pressed against my palm through the leather. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The humidity hit me, frizzing the hair I had spent an hour smoothing down. I smoothed my beige dress. I checked my reflection in the side mirror of a parked Mercedes. I looked harmless. I looked like a woman who could be ignored. I looked like a woman who could be silenced in any language. But as we walked toward the unmarked door of the club, I had a thought that I did not write down, but I burned it into my mind anyway. If they think I am just a footnote, I thought, they have forgotten that the footnotes are where the real story is hidden. I took Dominic's arm. His muscles were hard as stone. We walked toward the light, toward the crystal, toward the man who spoke dead languages, and I knew, with a sudden terrifying clarity, that my plan to be invisible was about to fail. The Brackenwell house did not have a sign. It did not need one. If you belonged there, you knew where it was. If you did not know where it was, you were not the sort of person who was welcome to find it. It sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Georgetown, a massive structure of red brick and black shutters, indistinguishable from the other historic mansions surrounding it, save for the subtle presence of 2 men standing at the bottom of the limestone steps. They were not wearing security uniforms. They were wearing suits that cost more than my car, tailored to conceal the bulk of muscle and weaponry underneath. Dominic and I approached the entrance. The humidity of the evening seemed to stop at the property line, repelled by the sheer force of exclusivity. I could feel the sweat drying cold on the back of my neck. Dominic handed his identification to the taller of the 2 men. The guard glanced at it, glanced at the list on his tablet, and gave a curt nod. Dominic stepped onto the first stair. I followed. I held out my driver's license. The guard took it. He did not glance. He studied it. He held it up to the light coming from the gas lantern above the door. He looked at the photo. Then he looked at my face. Then he looked back at the photo. It was a performance of scrutiny designed to make me feel like a fraud. He swiped his thumb across the screen of his tablet, scrolling slowly, agonizingly slowly, while a couple in evening wear waited impatiently behind me. I stood there in my beige dress, clutching my bag, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. This was the first gate. This was the first reminder that while my last name might be Clearfield, I was not the Clearfield who mattered. Finally, the guard lowered the tablet. He did not hand my license back to me. He placed it on the small podium next to him, forcing me to reach out and retrieve it like a supplicant. As I stepped past him, I heard the other guard lean in. He did not whisper. Not really. He spoke in that low, caring register that staff members use when they want to be heard but cannot be seen speaking. "That is the sister," he said. "The other sister." The words hit me in the spine. I did not turn around. I kept walking, my heels clicking on the stone, chasing the retreating figure of my husband who had already disappeared inside. The other sister, it was a title I had worn for 3 years, ever since Maris had caught the eye of the Vale heir. It implied a binary state of existence. There was the sister who was chosen, and the sister who was left over. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and entered the foyer. The interior of the Brackenwell house was designed to intimidate. The ceilings vaulted 20 feet overhead, hung with chandeliers that dripped crystal like frozen tears. The walls were paneled in dark walnut and lined with oil portraits of men who had been dead for 100 years. Senators, rail barons, judges, they all looked the same. They all had heavy brows, severe mouths, and eyes that seemed to follow you with a mixture of judgment and boredom. The air conditioning was aggressive. It was not just cool, it was preserving. The temperature felt artificially locked at 65 degrees, a climate meant for furs and wool, not for the thin silk of my off-the-rack dress. I felt a shiver run down my arms. The sound was the first thing that truly unsettled me. It was quiet. There were perhaps 80 people in the main ballroom ahead, but the noise level was hushed, muffled by thick Persian rugs and velvet drapes. A jazz quartet was playing in the corner, a piano, a bass, drums, and a saxophone. They were playing perfectly, technically flawless, but there was no soul in it. The music was not there to be listened to. It was there to fill the gaps in conversation, to act as a sonic wallpaper that prevented total silence. Dominic was waiting for me by the coat check, wringing his hands. We walked together into the ballroom. A maitre d' with a face like a hawk intercepted us. He asked for our names, though I suspected he already knew exactly where to put us. He led us through the maze of round tables draped in heavy white linen. We walked past the center tables. We walked past the tables near the windows. We walked past the tables near the band. He stopped at a small table for 4, tucked into the back corner of the room, directly next to the swinging double doors that led to the kitchen. Table 19. I looked at the placement. It was a masterclass in social geography. From here, we could see the entire room, but the room could not really see us. Every time a waiter exited the kitchen with a tray of appetizers, a burst of noise and the smell of searing scallops would wash over us. We were in the blind spot. We were the backstage crew allowed to watch the play from the wings, but forbidden to step onto the stage. I sat down. The chair was gilt wood and velvet, uncomfortable and stiff. Dominic sat next to me, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for an exit. Then my mother arrived. Lorraine Clearfield appeared in the archway of the ballroom. She paused there, waiting for eyes to find her. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue, a color that usually suited her, but tonight she looked brittle. I saw the necklace immediately. It was new. It was a choker of sapphires and diamonds, heavy and ornate, sitting on her collarbone like a royal collar. It was too big. It was too much. It was the kind of jewelry you wear when you are trying to prove you can afford to be in the room. She spotted us and made her way over, her movements fluttery and nervous. She smiled at everyone she passed, a wide, fixed grimace that did not waver. When she reached our table, she did not sit. She gripped the back of the empty chair opposite me. Her hands were shaking. I looked at her manicured fingers, clutching the velvet upholstery. The knuckles were white. The sapphires at her throat trembled with the beat of her pulse. "You are here," she said, her voice breathy. "Good, good. Is the hair all right?" She touched her own perfectly sprayed coiffure. I was worried the humidity would ruin it. "You look fine." "Mother," I said. She did not look at me. She was scanning the room, her eyes darting from face to face, terrified she had missed someone important. "We have to be careful tonight." "Winna," she whispered, leaning down. "Gideon is in a mood. I heard him talking to the caterers. He wants everything perfect. Do not draw attention. Just be supportive." I looked at the fear in her eyes. It was not the fear of a mother worried about her daughter's wedding. It was the fear of an employee worried about losing a job. She was afraid of making a mistake. She was afraid that if she used the wrong fork or laughed too loud, the check would bounce and the debt would come crashing back down on us. Then the air in the room shifted. It was a physical sensation, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. The jazz band quieted down, transitioning into a lower, slower tempo. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Maris had entered. My sister was beautiful. There was no denying that. She was wearing white, a sleek, modern gown that hugged her frame, devoid of lace or frills. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe knot, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. She looked like a statue carved from marble. She smiled. I knew my sister's face better than anyone. I knew the crinkle by her eyes when she was genuinely happy. I knew the way her mouth quirked when she was trying not to laugh. This smile had none of that. It was framed. It was a smile she had put on in the mirror and held in place with sheer willpower. Her eyes were wide, too wide, staring straight ahead with the intense, dilated focus of a student walking into an oral exam they were not prepared for. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a hostage who had been told that if she behaved, she might get a glass of water later. And then, a step behind her, came Gideon Vale. He did not walk like a fiancé. He did not offer his arm to her. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, strolling with a casual arrogance that screamed ownership. He did not look at Maris. He looked at the room. He looked at the guests. He nodded once, a sharp, imperial gesture that acknowledged their presence without thanking them for it. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the silence of a pack recognizing the alpha. Gideon moved to Maris's side. He did not take her hand. He did not place a hand on the small of her back. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around her wrist. I watched, transfixed. It was not a caress. His thumb pressed into the soft skin of her inner wrist, right over the pulse point. His fingers circled the bone completely. It was a hold. It was a shackle made of flesh and bone. He guided her forward, steering her like a prized mare at an auction. Maris did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, her shoulders slumping slightly, as if the fight had gone out of her long ago. They moved through the room, stopping to greet the most important guests. Gideon did the talking. Maris nodded. Maris smiled. Maris existed. I tore my eyes away from the spectacle of my sister's submission and looked around the room, trying to find something, anything, to anchor myself. That was when I saw the table near the center, the one with the best view. It was occupied by a group of men speaking French. I could hear the cadence of their conversation drifting over the low hum of the jazz. They were older, distinguished, drinking red wine instead of the champagne that was being circulated. One man sat in the center of the group. He had silver hair, thick and swept back, and he wore a suit that was cut differently than the Americans. Softer shoulders, a darker fabric. He was not talking. He was not looking at Gideon or Maris. He was looking at me. His name was Lucien Beaumont. I recognized him from the business journals I read for work, the ones that detailed the obscure and powerful figures of European contract law. He was a legend in the field, a man who brokered deals between nations. He was staring directly at table 19. He was not looking at me with the dismissal of the doorman or the pity of the staff. He was looking at me with a narrowed, intense curiosity. He held his wine glass suspended halfway to his mouth. It was the look of a man who sees a puzzle piece that has fallen on the floor and is trying to figure out where it fits. I met his gaze. I did not look away. For 3 seconds, across the expanse of white linen and crystal, we held a silent conversation. Then Gideon laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound from the center of the room. I snapped my head back. Gideon was standing 10 feet away from our table now, holding court. He had released Maris's wrist and was gesturing with a champagne flute. He was looking at me too, but his look was different. It was the look of a predator who had just remembered he left a mouse in the corner to play with later. The waiter kicked the back of my chair as he rushed out of the kitchen with a tray of hot appetizers. "Excuse me," he muttered, not stopping. I adjusted my chair. I took a sip of water. I touched the notebook in my bag. The cold light of the chandeliers beat down on us. The jazz played on, and I sat in the blind spot, watching the man who owned my family tighten his grip, while the silver-haired stranger watched me. The orbit of the room shifted when Gideon Vale decided to acknowledge our table. It was not a casual drifting of a host mingling with his guests. It was a calculated descent. He detached himself from a circle of senators near the center of the room and cut a straight line toward the corner where we were hidden. Pulling the attention of the room with him like a tide, my mother, Lorraine stiffened in her chair. She smoothed the napkin on her lap 3 times in rapid succession, her eyes widening with a mixture of terror and gratitude. She looked like a spaniel, hoping to be petted but expecting to be kicked. Gideon arrived at our table. He smelled of sandalwood and something sharper, like the ozone scent of a thunderstorm. "Lorraine," he said. His voice was rich, wrapping around her name with a warmth that I knew was entirely synthetic. "You look radiant tonight. That sapphire is a stunning choice. It brings out the authority in your eyes." My mother practically melted into the tablecloth. "Oh, Gideon," she breathed, reaching out to touch his arm lightly, then pulling back as if remembering she was not allowed to initiate contact. "You are too kind. We are just so happy to be here. Everything is magnificent." Gideon smiled at her. A benevolent landlord granting a tenant an extension. Then, the smile vanished. He turned his head 2 inches to the right and looked at me. The warmth evaporated. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. He did not extend a hand. He did not offer a cheek for a social kiss. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels, and looked me up and down. It was not a sexual look. It was an actuarial one. He was checking the inventory. He was looking for cracks in the porcelain, rust on the bumper. He was assessing whether I was going to be a liability to the brand he was building with my sister. "Winna," he said. "Gideon," I replied. I kept my voice flat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a tremor. He tilted his head, his gray eyes boring into mine. "I heard you are still working at that bureau. What is it called again? The one in the basement of the federal building. It is the Hawthorne Ridge Integrity Bureau," I said, "and we are on the 4th floor." "Right," he said, chuckling softly. The sound was dry, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. Integrity, a noble concept. I always wonder about jobs like that. Tell me, Winna, does analyzing commas in dusty contracts actually generate any revenue? Or is it more of a charitable endeavor, a hobby to pass the time? The insult was masterfully constructed. It was wrapped in enough polite curiosity that if I got angry, I would look defensive and unrefined. But the blade was there. He was asking if I was worthless. He was asking if I made enough money to matter in his world. "It pays the mortgage." "Gideon," I said, holding his gaze. He smirked, a tiny twitch of the corner of his mouth. "Does it? That is charming. It is good to have small victories." He turned back to my mother before I could respond, cutting me out of the conversation as if he had hit a mute button. "Lorraine, I have a small favor to ask. The staff is overwhelmed tonight. It is hard to find good help that understands the nuance of service these days. Maris is parched. She is stuck talking to the ambassador of Belgium and cannot get away." My mother sat up straighter. "Anything, Gideon. What do you need, Winna?" he said, saying my name without looking at me. "Be a dear and fetch Maris a glass of the vintage rose. The waiters are moving at a glacial pace, and I do not want her waiting. You know how she gets when her throat is dry." It was not a question. It was a command. He was treating me, the sister of the bride, like a server. He was telling the room that my function here was to fetch and carry. My mother did not hesitate. "Winna, go," she said, shooing me with her hand. "You know where the bar is. Hurry up. Do not make Maris wait." I looked at Gideon. He was watching me from the corner of his eye, waiting for the rebellion. He wanted me to say no. He wanted me to cause a scene so he could sigh, apologize to the ambassador for my rudeness, and have me escorted out for being difficult. He was baiting the trap, so I did not step into it. I stood up slowly. I picked up my clutch. I smoothed the front of my beige dress. "Of course," I said. "I would love to get my sister a drink." I saw a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had wanted a fight. I gave him obedience. I turned and walked away from the table, heading toward the main bar on the far side of the room. I walked with my head high, but inside, my stomach was churning acid. I was playing the long game. I told myself. I was letting him think I was broken so he would not see the knife I was sharpening. The path to the bar took me near the service entrance, a heavy swinging door that led to the kitchens and staff corridors. As I passed, the door swung open slightly, and a burst of noise escaped, clattering plates, shouting chefs, and a voice I recognized. It was the catering manager. A frantic woman with a headset. She was hissing at a young waiter who looked like he was about to cry. Mr. Vale fired the last one because he didn't pour from the right side. She whispered harshly, "Do not look him in the eye. Do not speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, watch your tone." He fired the valet captain 10 minutes ago because he didn't like the tone of his apology. I slowed my pace, pretending to adjust my shoe strap. It was confirmation. Gideon was not just exacting control over his family, he was terrorizing the entire ecosystem of the party. He was a man who believed that other people's dignity was a resource he could consume to fuel his own ego. I reached the bar. It was a slab of black marble manned by 3 bartenders who moved with the efficiency of robots. 2 glasses of the vintage rose. "Please," I said. The bartender nodded and began to pour. I turned to lean against the bar, scanning the room while I waited. My eyes drifted past the velvet ropes that separated the ballroom from the private corridors leading to the library and the security offices. That was when I saw him. Dominic. My husband, who was supposed to be at our table, or perhaps in the restroom, was standing in the shadows of the hallway. He was not alone. He was talking to a man I recognized from the security checkpoint, the head of Gideon's personal detail, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and a scar running through his left eyebrow. I froze. Dominic looked agitated. He was gesturing with his hands, his face pale and sweating under the hall lights. The security man was listening impassively, arms crossed over his chest. He nodded once, then handed Dominic something. It was small and metallic, a key card, a flash drive I could not tell. Dominic shoved it quickly into his pocket and looked over his shoulder, checking to see if he was being watched. His eyes met mine, for a second. Time seemed to suspend itself. The noise of the party faded into a dull roar. Dominic went rigid. I saw the blood drain from his face. He did not wave. He did not smile. He looked guilty. It was the look of a man caught burying a body. I abandoned the bar. I walked toward the hallway, ignoring the staff-only sign. Dominic saw me coming and stepped out to meet me, blocking my path before I could get too close to the security office. "Dominic," I said, my voice low. "What are you doing? Who was that?" He grabbed my elbow. His grip was too tight. "Winna, not here. What is going on?" I asked, pulling my arm away. "You disappeared. I saw you with Gideon's head of security. Why is the head of security giving you things?" Dominic looked around wildly. "He's not. Look, I'm just helping check the systems." "Check the systems," I repeated, incredulous. "You are a project manager. Dominic, you are not an electrician. You are not a IT. Why are you checking Gideon's systems in the middle of the engagement party?" He wiped sweat from his forehead. "It is complicated. Winna, the ventilation in the library. Gideon asked me to look at the schematics. He knows I have a background in commercial retrofitting. He just wanted a second opinion before the guests go in there for cigars later. He was lying. I knew it instantly. Dominic was a terrible liar. He always over-explained. If it were true, he would have complained about Gideon making him work. He would have rolled his eyes. He would not be looking at me with that desperate, pleading intensity. And the security guard, I asked, why was he there? He was just letting me in. Dominic said quickly, too quickly, "Look, I have to go wash my hands. I got dust on them. Go back to the table. I will be right there." He turned and walked away from me, heading toward the restrooms with a speed that bordered on fleeing. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. My husband was hiding something. My mother was cowering. My sister was a hostage, and I was standing in a hallway holding nothing but a sense of impending doom. I walked back to the bar. The bartender had placed 2 crystal flutes of pink champagne on the counter. I picked them up. The glass was cool against my fingers. I needed a drink. I needed the alcohol to steady the tremor in my hands before I faced Gideon again. I walked back across the room, navigating the sea of tuxedos and gowns. I felt like a spy in enemy territory. carrying contraband. When I reached table 19, Gideon was still there. He was leaning over my mother, whispering something that made her giggle nervously. He straightened up as I approached. "Ah," he said, "the courier returns." I held out one of the glasses. "For Maris," I said. He took the glass. He did not say thank you. He placed it on the table. Then he looked at the second glass in my hand, the one I intended to drink, the one I needed to stop the room from spinning. "And is that for the courier herself?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock solicitude. "Yes," I said. He reached out and took the glass from my fingers. He did it slowly, peeling my fingers off the stem one by one, invading my personal space until I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He lifted the glass to his lips, took a sip, and then grimaced. "Warm," he said. He set the glass down on the table with a heavy clink. "Passable for the staff, I suppose, but I would not recommend it for a guest." He looked around at the nearby tables. A few people were watching, a couple of lobbyists, a minor celebrity. Winna has simple tastes. Gideon said to them, loud enough to be heard, "She is used to sturdier beverages." The lobbyists chuckled. I stood there, empty-handed. He had taken my drink. He had not taken it because he wanted it. He had taken it because I had it. It was a small thing, a glass of wine. But in the language of power, it was a sentence. He was telling me that I owned nothing. I did not own my time. I did not own my dignity. I did not even own the liquid in my glass. He smiled at me, a cold, shark-like baring of teeth. "You should sit down. Winna," he said softly. "You look tired. Standing around seems to exhaust you." I sat down in the hard chair, in the blind spot, next to my terrified mother. Gideon turned his back on us, returning to the center of the room to bask in the admiration of people he despised. I looked at the glass of rose sitting on the table. It was right there, within reach, but I knew I could not touch it. If I touched it, I lost. I looked at the service door where Dominic had disappeared. This was not just arrogance. This was not just a rich man being rude to his poor relations. This was a ritual. Gideon was systematically dismantling us. He was breaking my mother with kindness, breaking Maris with fear, breaking Dominic with something else, blackmail, coercion. And he was trying to break me with humiliation. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel like a child who had been sent to the corner. But as I sat there, watching the back of his expensive tuxedo, I felt something else. It was not shame. The shame had burned off in the hallway when I saw my husband's eyes. What I felt now was cold, hard, and sharp. I reached into my bag and touched the spine of my notebook. He thinks this is a hierarchy. I thought, he thinks he is the king, and I am the peasant. I watched him laugh at a joke made by a Swiss banker. He has forgotten. I told myself, in the history of the world, peasants are the ones who sharpen the pitchforks, and I know exactly where the gaps in his armor are. I waited for Dominic to return. I waited for the next act, and for the first time all night, I stopped shaking. The phone buzzed against my thigh, a vibration so violent in the silence of my personal exile that it felt like a nerve twitching. I slipped my hand into my clutch under the tablecloth, shielding the screen from Gideon's prying eyes across the room. It was the second message. The number was still blocked. The text was stark, glowing white against the black void of the screen. He does not marry for love. He marries to silence. I stared at the words. My heart gave a singular, hard thud against my ribs. Silence. Silence. What Maris was not a whistleblower. She was a 26-year-old girl who liked watercolor painting and rescue dogs. She had no secrets that could topple an empire, unless the secret was not hers, but something she was standing on top of. I looked up. Gideon was moving. He had stepped away from the circle of admirers, pressing a phone to his ear. His body language had shifted from the relaxed arrogance of a host to the coiled tension of a traitor. He walked toward the heavy velvet drapes that concealed the entrance to the terrace. I stood up. "Where are you going?" my mother hissed. She grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin. Gideon said to sit. I need the ladies' room. Mother, I lied. Unless Gideon has a schedule for my bladder too, she let go. Her eyes darting nervously toward the head of security standing near the kitchen. Be quick, she whispered. Please, Winna, do not wander. I walked toward the restrooms, keeping my pace even, but the moment I passed the pillar that blocked my mother's line of sight, I veered left. I slipped behind a massive potted fern and pressed myself against the wall, inching toward the terrace doors where Gideon had disappeared. The doors were glass, slightly ajar to let in the night air. I could smell cigarette smoke, expensive tobacco, clove and molasses. I held my breath. I could hear his voice. It was low, stripped of the charming veneer he used for the guests. I do not care what the old man wants, Gideon was saying. His voice was a growl. The Beaumont term sheet is the only thing that matters. We close tonight. Tonight. Do you understand? There was a pause. I pressed my ear closer to the gap in the door. Beaumont. The name slammed into me. Lucien Beaumont, the silver-haired man at table 4 who had looked at me like I was a missing puzzle piece. Gideon spoke again, sharper this time. Listen to me. Beaumont is sentimental. He likes the narrative of the family business. That is why the wedding is the backdrop. It proves stability. It proves legacy. If he finds out about the liquidity issues in the shell companies, the deal is dead. Do not let him play moral games with me. Keep him drinking. I will sign the papers in the library at 10 o'clock. He hung up. I heard the click of a lighter. My mind was racing. A term sheet. A closing. The wedding wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger. Gideon was using my sister as a prop to secure a deal with Lucien Beaumont. Maris was not the bride. She was the bait. He needed to look like a stable family man to court an investor who valued tradition. I backed away slowly, my heels silent on the carpet. I needed to get back to the table before he saw me. But my blood was boiling. It was not just exploitation. It was fraud. When I slid back into my chair at table 19, my mother was staring at her untouched salad. Her face was gray. She looked like a woman who was holding her breath underwater. Mother, I said. She jumped. You are back. Good. Sit. Eat something. I leaned in. I did not pick up my fork. I lowered my voice to a whisper that was barely audible over the jazz. Why is this wedding happening? Mother. She blinked, her fake eyelashes fluttering. What a silly question. They are in love. Gideon adores her. Stop it, I said. I let the anger bleed into my voice, sharp and cold. I just heard him on the phone. He is closing a business deal tonight. He is using this reception as a stage. Maris is just collateral. My mother's face crumbled. For a second, the mask of the society matron slipped, revealing a terrified, aging woman underneath. Winna, please, stop digging. I am not digging, I said. I am looking at the hole we are already in. Why are you so afraid of him? It is not just social climbing, is it? We are Clearfields. We have a good name. We do not need his money this badly. Dad left you comfortable. My mother let out a small, strangled sound. She looked around the room, terrified of eavesdroppers. Then she stood up. Come with me, she said. Her voice was brittle. She led me not to the restroom, but to a small alcove near the coat check. Hidden behind a display of antique vases, it was a dusty corner where the light didn't quite reach. She turned to me. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together against her chest to stop the tremors. Your father did not leave us comfortable. Winna, she whispered. Her voice was trembling. He left us hollowed out. I stared at her. What, the investments, she said. The year before he died, he leveraged everything, the house, the pension, the trust. He thought he could make it back. He lost it all. When he died, all he left was debt. 7 figures of debt. I felt the floor tilt. 7 figures. Why didn't you tell me I tried to fix it? She cried softly. I took out loans to pay the loans. It spiraled. By the time Maris met Gideon, we were months away from foreclosure. We were going to lose the house. We were going to lose everything. So Gideon paid it off, I asked, feeling a sick sense of clarity. That is why we are here. He was the savior. My mother looked down at her shoes. She could not meet my eyes. He did not pay it off. She whispered, "Then what?" He bought it. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. "I don't understand." I said, "He bought the debt. Winna, he used a holding company, a shell company. I didn't know it was him at first. They approached the bank and purchased the distressed assets. They bought the mortgage. They bought the personal loans. They even bought—" She stopped. She squeezed her eyes shut. "They bought what? Mother?" She took a breath that sounded like a sob. "They bought the medical debt." I froze. "What medical debt?" "You have health insurance. Not mine," she said. She opened her eyes and looked at me, and the shame in them was bottomless. "Yours and Dominic's." I took a step back, hitting the wall. "Dominic. 3 years ago," she said, "when Dominic had that surgery, the experimental treatment for his spine after the car accident, the insurance denied it. I remembered. I remembered the nights I spent awake, terrified he would never walk without pain again. I remembered the appeal letters, and then I remembered the miracle. The hospital had called and said a donor program had covered the balance. I thought it was charity. I thought it was grace. It wasn't a program. My mother said, it was Gideon, or rather, it was a shell company owned by Gideon. He bought the debt from the hospital collections. He holds the paper. Winna, he owns the debt on your husband's spine." The room spun. My husband, my Dominic, the man who was currently running around checking ventilation systems like a servant. He wasn't doing it for favor. He was doing it because he was an indentured servant. Gideon literally owned the cost of his ability to walk. He holds it over us. My mother wept. Every month, he decides whether to call it in. If he calls it in, we are bankrupt instantly. Dominic would be sued for hundreds of thousands of dollars. You would lose your house. I would be on the street. She grabbed my hands. That is why Maris is marrying him. She found out. She found out he bought the debt to get close to her, to trap her. He told her that as long as she is his wife, the debt stays dormant. If she leaves, he ruins us all. I looked at my mother, and I felt a wave of nausea so strong I almost retched. It was not a marriage. It was a hostage negotiation. Gideon had not just courted my sister. He had systematically acquired the liabilities of my entire family. He had purchased our failures, our sicknesses, our mistakes, and he had woven them into a net. And then, like a camera shutter clicking, a memory flashed in my mind. Paris, 5 years ago, I was sitting in a cafe near the Sorbonne, drinking espresso, feeling the thrill of my own future. I had the fellowship. I had the life I wanted. Then the phone rang. It was Maris. She was crying. She was hysterical. "Winna, please, you have to come home. I messed up. I met this man. He says he can help. But I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Mom is sick with worry. Please." I had thought she was just overwhelmed. I thought she was a young girl who had gotten into a bad relationship or some minor legal trouble. I flew home. I gave up the fellowship because my family needed me. I realize now, standing in the dark corner of the Brackenwell house, that I had walked right into the cage Gideon had already built. Maris had called me because Gideon had already started tightening the screws. He must have targeted us years ago. Why us? We weren't billionaires. We weren't political royalty. Then I remembered the text message. He does not marry for love. He marries to silence. And I remembered the look Lucien Beaumont gave me. And I remembered my own name on the spine of my thesis in the university library, The Binding Power of Archaic Contract Law. The pieces slammed together. Gideon didn't need our money. He needed our legitimacy. Or maybe he needed something I had, or something I knew. I looked out at the ballroom. I saw Maris standing near the cake. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was staring at nothing. I looked at her dress. It wasn't white silk. It was a shroud. I looked at Gideon, laughing with the investors, holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my car. He looked untouchable. He looked like a man who had calculated every variable. He had bought my mother's silence with fear. He had bought my sister's body with duty. He had bought my husband's labor with medical bills. He thought he owned us, but he had made a mistake, a critical, fatal error. He had bought the debt, but he hadn't checked the terms of the one person in the family who read fine print for a living. He thought I was just the sister who failed. He didn't know that I was the one who had spent 10 years studying how tyrants fall. I pulled my hands away from my mother's grip. "Winna," she pleaded, promise me you will be quiet." I looked at her. I loved her, but she was weak. She had sold us out to save her own comfort, and then convinced herself it was for our survival. "I am done being quiet." "Mother," I said. My voice was steady. It was the voice of the woman I used to be in Paris. I turned and walked back into the ballroom. I was not walking back to table 19. I was walking into a war zone. I looked for Dominic. He hadn't returned. The fear in my chest for him was a physical weight, but it was hardening into something else. Rage. Cold. Diamond-hard rage. Gideon Vale had used paper to enslave my family. He had used numbers and signatures and shell companies to turn us into puppets. Fine, if he wanted to play with paper, I would show him what happens when you get a paper cut in the wrong place. I walked toward the table where Lucien Beaumont sat. I didn't go all the way. I stopped near a pillar, just close enough to be seen if he looked up. I took out my notebook. I opened it to a blank page, and I wrote down one sentence. The debt is the leverage. The term sheet is the lock. The language is the key. I looked up. Lucien Beaumont was watching me again. He saw the notebook. He saw the pen. And for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, imperceptible quirk of the lips. He knew. He knew I wasn't just a guest. He knew I was the variable Gideon hadn't accounted for. I closed the notebook with a snap. Gideon Vale wanted a show. He wanted to demonstrate his power to the room. He was about to get a demonstration he hadn't paid for. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, the noise of the party washing over me like a tide of static, the knowledge of the debt, the 7 figures, the medical bills, the leverage, sat in my stomach like swallowed lead. I was no longer just a guest. I was a liability that had been purchased and shelved. I needed a moment to recalibrate. I needed to stop shaking. I leaned against a marble pillar, my back to the room, pretending to examine the intricate molding on the ceiling. "Ms. Clearfield." The voice was cool, low, and stripped of the decorative warmth that everyone else seemed to be wearing tonight. I turned. Standing before me was a woman I had seen only in the background of press photos. She was taller than me, wearing a tuxedo-style suit cut from black velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Her hair was a sharp geometric bob, the color of steel wool, and her glasses were frameless, making her eyes look uncomfortably naked and observant. I knew who she was, Renee Hawthorne. She was the general counsel for Vale Meridian Partners, the legal architect behind Gideon's empire. She was the one who drafted the NDAs. She was the one who made the problems go away. "Ms. Hawthorne," I said. I was surprised my voice was steady. She did not smile. She held a glass of mineral water, her fingers long and devoid of jewelry. "You know who I am," she stated. It was not a question. "Good. That saves time." She took a step closer, invading my personal space just enough to lower her voice without looking conspiratorial. She looked out at the room, her gaze tracking Gideon as he charmed a circle of investors near the buffet. "You are standing on a trap door." "Winna," she said softly. I stiffened. "Excuse me, Gideon," she said, still not looking at me. "He does not like being outshined. And he certainly does not like loose ends." "You are a loose end. I am the sister of the bride," I said defensively. "You are the sister who asks questions." She corrected. "And tonight, you are the prop in a narrative he is constructing. I have worked for Gideon for 8 years. I have seen him manage mergers, acquisitions, and hostile takeovers. He uses the same strategy for families as he does for corporations." "And what strategy is that?" I asked, my grip tightening on my clutch. Distressed asset liquidation, she said. She took a sip of water. He identifies the weak link. He isolates it, and then he creates an event. A breach of protocol, a public embarrassment, a flash of anger, to justify cutting that link loose. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He is baiting you. Renee continued. The insults about your job, the way he ordered you to fetch drinks, the way he is keeping your husband busy with menial tasks. He wants you to snap. He wants you to throw a drink, or raise your voice, or cause a scene. Why, I asked. Because if you cause a scene, you become the unstable sister, she said flatly. You become the jealous, bitter academic who could not handle her sister's success. It invalidates anything you might say later. If you try to speak up about the debt, or the coercion, or the business deals, no one will listen. They will just say, "Oh, that is just Winna. She had a breakdown at the engagement party. She is clearly unwell." I looked at her. Her face was impassive, but her words were a roadmap of my destruction. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You work for him." Renee turned her head and looked at me directly. Her eyes were hard. "I am a lawyer. Ms. Clearfield. I deal in contracts and compliance. I clean up messes. I do not like messes that are created intentionally for sport. It is inefficient." She paused, swirling the water in her glass. "Besides," she added, her voice dropping a decibel, "Gideon has a temper. It has cost the firm a great deal of money in the past. Settlements, hush money, non-disclosure agreements signed in hospital waiting rooms. He thinks he is untouchable because he owns the paper. But everyone has a breaking point. I am just managing the risk." She looked at me with a new intensity, her gaze dropping to the clutch where I kept my notebook. "I reviewed your personnel file," she said suddenly. "When Gideon ran the background check on your family, of course he ran a background check. I thought bitterly, you have a doctorate in historical linguistics," she said. "Specifically, the evolution of legal syntax in the Angevin Empire." I nodded slowly. "Yes, and you work for the Hawthorne Ridge Integrity Bureau, analyzing contract loopholes," she continued. "Yes," Renee hummed, a low sound in her throat. "Interesting. Most people assume that because you are not wealthy, you are not dangerous. Gideon certainly thinks so. He thinks language is just a tool for humiliation. He forgets it is also a tool for binding." She checked her watch. A masculine, square-faced timepiece. "Do not let him provoke you. Winna, that is my professional advice. If you want to survive tonight, be boring, be invisible. Do not give him the incident he is shopping for." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Ms. Clearfield, if you do decide to burn him down, make sure you have the documentation. He shreds everything by midnight." She walked away, slicing through the crowd like a shark through water, leaving me standing by the pillar with my heart hammering against my ribs. I made my way back to table 19. My mother was gone, likely in the ladies' room, reapplying her lipstick and her denial. I sat down in the empty chair, the blind spot, the safe zone. I put my hands on the table. They were trembling. Renee's warning rang in my ears. "He wants you to snap." I took a deep breath, forcing my lungs to expand against the corset of my dress. I would not snap. I would be ice. I would be stone. "May I join you?" The voice was accented, rich and gravelly, like stones rolling in a riverbed. I looked up. Lucien Beaumont was standing at my table. Up close. He was even more imposing. He was an older man, perhaps 70, but he carried himself with the vitality of someone much younger. He had the silver hair of a statesman and the eyes of a hawk. He held a glass of red wine in one hand. "Of course," I stammered, gesturing to the empty chair where my mother had been sitting. He sat. He did not sit like a guest making polite conversation. He sat like a judge taking the bench. He placed his wineglass on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the napkin. "You are the sister," he said. "I am," I replied. "Winna Clearfield, Lucien Beaumont." He said, he did not offer a hand to shake. He simply studied me. "It is a tedious affair." Isn't it? He asked, waving a hand at the room. The champagne is too sweet, the music is too safe, and the conversation is expensive. I allowed a small, tight smile. Expensive is one word for it. He chuckled. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. Gideon tells me you are a student of history. He says you enjoy old things. He made it sound like an insult, echoing Gideon's earlier tone. I felt a spike of defensiveness, but I remembered Renee's warning. Do not snap. I study language. Mr. Beaumont. I said evenly, history is just the context. Ah, he said, language. He took a sip of wine, watching me over the rim of the glass. Then, without a pause, without a shift in his expression, he spoke. It was French, a quote by Talleyrand. Speech was given to man to disguise his thoughts. I looked at him. It was a test. He was checking if I was just a suburban housewife who knew how to say bonjour, or if I actually understood the game. I replied in English, but I chose my words with the precision of a translator. And yet, I said, silence often tells the truth that speech tries to hide. Lucian's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, a flicker of approval, or just amusement. He leaned forward. The air between us shifted. The noise of the party seemed to recede. Then he switched. He did not speak French. He did not speak English. He spoke the same language Gideon had used to humiliate me earlier. Anglo-Norman, but unlike Gideon, whose pronunciation had been theatrically exaggerated, Lucian spoke it with a flat, brutal fluency. It was a legal maxim, archaic and obscure. He who holds the key holds the house, but he who holds the pen holds the truth. He was testing my depth. Gideon had used the language as a club. Lucian was using it as a scalpel. He wanted to know if I had just memorized a few phrases or if I understood the structural power of the tongue. My heart beat faster. This was my ground. This was the world I had been forced to leave, the world I still lived in during the quiet hours at my desk in Baltimore. I looked him in the eye. I did not falter. I did not stutter. I replied in Anglo-Norman. My accent was academic, perhaps a bit dusty from lack of use, but grammatically flawless. The truth cannot be hidden. When the law is written in blood, it was a bold response. It was dangerous. I was implying that the law here, the contract, the marriage, the deal, was tainted. Lucian Beaumont stared at me. For 5 seconds. He did not move. He did not blink. He looked at me as if I had just pulled a sword out of a stone. Then, slowly, a genuine smile spread across his face. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a general who has just realized the opposing army has a competent commander. Remarkable, he said, switching back to English. His voice was soft, appreciative. Gideon told me you were a hobbyist. He said you dabbled. Gideon says many things, I said, my voice cool. Lucian laughed, a short bark of a laugh that made a nearby waiter jump. Indeed he does. Indeed he does. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a small, cream-colored card. It was heavy stock, embossed with a simple crest. There was no phone number, just a name and a private email address. He slid it across the tablecloth. He did not hand it to me. He pushed it until it rested right next to my hand. Ms. Clearfield, he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. Tonight is a theater. We are all actors, but some of us know the script better than others. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. If you are made into entertainment later tonight, he said, looking down at me, remember this entertainment is sometimes just a distraction, but it is also a test. The question is not whether you can take the joke. The question is whether you can rewrite the punchline. He nodded once, turned, and walked back to his table of French investors. I stared at the card. Lucian Beaumont. I picked it up. It felt heavy. It felt like a weapon. My phone buzzed again in my lap. I looked down. It was Dominic. The message was short. If something happens, don't stand alone. I am trying to get back to you. Be careful. He is watching. I looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. I looked at the service door where my husband was trapped. I looked at the table where the most powerful man in European contract law had just validated my existence. Renee had warned me that Gideon was setting a trap. Lucian had told me that this was a test, and Dominic was telling me not to stand alone. I slipped the business card into my notebook, right next to the page where I had written my own declaration of war. I was not alone, not anymore. The network was opening, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't feel like the invisible sister. I felt like the one holding the pen. The chiming of a silver spoon against a crystal flute is a sound that is supposed to signal celebration. It is the sound of a toast, a well-wish, a moment of shared joy. But when Gideon Vale struck his glass, the sound was sharp and violent, like a crack in a frozen lake. It cut through the low murmur of conversation in the ballroom, silencing the jazz quartet instantly, as if he had severed their power cord with his gaze alone. The room froze. Waiters stopped mid-pour. Guests turned in their chairs, the silk of their gowns rustling like dry leaves. Gideon stood at the head of the room, near the tiered wedding cake that looked more like a fortress than a dessert. He held his champagne glass aloft, catching the light of the chandeliers. He looked golden. He looked like a prince in a fairy tale written by a sociopath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice was amplified by the acoustics of the room. Rich and commanding, we have dined. We have drunk. We have discussed the markets and the weather. But before we move to the dessert course, I think we are due for a little intellectual entertainment. He smiled. It was the smile of a cat that has just cornered a mouse and wants to play with it before the kill. "You see," he continued, strolling slowly among the tables, one hand in his pocket, "tonight is not just about the union of two families. It is about the merging of histories. The Vales have always valued culture. We value the ancient roots of our society. And it has come to my attention that we have a scholar in our midst." He paused. He pivoted on his heel, and he pointed his glass directly at table 19. The blind spot was no longer blind. I felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes land on me. It was a physical pressure, heavy and suffocating. My future sister-in-law, Winna Clearfield, he announced. My mother let out a small, terrified squeak next to me. She froze, her fork hovering halfway to her mouth. "Winna is a woman of unique interests," Gideon said, walking toward us. The crowd parted for him, creating a wide avenue of empty carpet, while most of us are concerned with the future, with innovation, with the next quarter. Winna prefers to live in the past. She is an enthusiast of ancient languages, a hobbyist of the dead and forgotten. A ripple of polite laughter went through the room. He had successfully framed my life's work, my doctorate, my research, my career, as a quaint, slightly embarrassing eccentricity, like knitting sweaters for cats or collecting spoons. I sat perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not look down. I kept my hands folded on the table, right next to the notebook that held Lucian Beaumont's card. Gideon reached our table. He loomed over me, blocking out the light from the main chandelier. "I myself have always had a fondness for history," he said, addressing the room but looking at me. "During my time in Europe, I took a delightful executive program on the roots of the French language. It was a fascinating 2 weeks. It gave me a profound appreciation for the tongues of our ancestors. It is a sign of true breeding, I think, to be able to speak the language of kings." He was lying, or rather, he was inflating a weekend seminar into a degree. He was claiming ownership of a culture he had merely rented. He looked down at me, his eyes glittering with malice. "Tell me, Winna," he said, "since you are the expert, surely you can regale us. It must be so quaint, to spend one's life buried in books while the rest of us are out here building the world." He swirled his champagne. "Let us have a demonstration," he said. "A little test, to see if the time you spent away from your family was worth the tuition." He cleared his throat. He straightened his posture, adopting a mock heroic stance, and then he spoke. He switched from English to Anglo-Norman French. It was the language of the courts of England in the 12th century. It was the language of the oppressor, the language of the law that crushed the Saxon peasantry. And Gideon spoke it with a confidence that was inversely proportional to his accuracy. "You are here, my little thing." He paused, waiting for a reaction. The room was silent. Most of the Americans looked confused. They smiled uncertainly, glancing at each other to see if they should be laughing. Then, the group at table 4, Lucien Beaumont's table, shifted. I saw one of the French investors frown. They understood. They knew he had just called me a thing, but they said nothing. They were guests. They were closing a deal. Silence was the price of the ticket. Gideon saw their silence and interpreted it as awe. He turned back to me, his grin widening. "Translate that for the room, Winna," he commanded. "Tell them what I said." I looked at him. I looked at his smug, self-satisfied face. He wanted me to repeat the insult. He wanted me to say, "You called me a little thing." He wanted me to validate his power. I remained silent. Gideon laughed. A loud, booming sound. "Ah," he said, "shy? Or perhaps rusty?" He leaned in closer. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering now, cloying and thick. "Let us try something simpler," he said. He raised his voice, projecting to the back of the room. He wanted everyone to hear this. He wanted to make sure that the humiliation was total. He spoke again in Anglo-Norman. This time, the sentence was longer, more complex, and far more vicious. "He who carries no gold should carry no speech. You are the weight that we carry." He had used the word weight. In modern French, it means weight, but in the legal dialect of the era he was butchering. It carried a specific connotation. It meant a burden attached to a prisoner, a dead weight. Translate, "Winna." He snapped. The room was uncomfortable now. Even the people who did not speak the language could hear the venom in his tone. They could feel the aggression. But Gideon was a billionaire, and I was nobody. So they did the only thing they knew how to do. They laughed. It started with a nervous titter from a woman in a red dress near the front. Then a man joined in. Then another. Soon. Half the room was chuckling. A wave of performative mirth designed to diffuse the tension and signal allegiance to the host. They were laughing at me. They were laughing because the powerful man was making fun of the quiet woman, and in their world, that was just how gravity worked. I looked at Maris. My sister was standing near the cake, clutching her glass of water so hard I thought it would shatter. Her face was the color of chalk. She did not speak Anglo-Norman. She did not know what he had said, but she knew Gideon. She knew the tone of voice he used when he was breaking something. She looked at me, and her eyes were wide with a silent scream. "I am sorry." Her eyes said, "I am so sorry." But she did not move. She stayed where she was, frozen in her white dress, a statue in Gideon's garden. Gideon was enjoying himself too much to stop now. The laughter of the crowd was like a drug to him. He stepped closer, invading my personal space until his thighs brushed against the tablecloth of table 19. He leaned down, placing one hand on the back of my mother's chair and the other on the table. Boxing me in. He lowered his voice, but in the silence of the room, it carried like a gunshot. He switched languages again, digging deeper into the archaic vocabulary, pulling out words that were used in property disputes and livestock inventories. "You are a parasite, a creature of surplus, without land, without blood." He spat the words out. Parasite, surplus. He was calling me useless. He was calling me a leech. He was telling me, to my face, in a language he thought was a secret code between us, that I was nothing but a biological accident that he had to tolerate. My mother stared at her plate, tears silently dripping onto the linen napkin. She was shaking. Her hand reached out under the table and gripped my knee. It was a desperate, clawing grip. "Please," her grip said, "please do not say anything. Please let him finish. If you fight back, he destroys us." I felt the heat rising in my neck. It was not embarrassment. It was not shame. It was a cold, white-hot clarity. He was not just insulting me. He was confirming everything. He was confirming the debt. He was confirming the purchase. He was confirming that he saw us not as family, but as livestock. I looked past Gideon's shoulder. I saw Dominic. My husband had emerged from the service corridor. He was standing by the pillar, 10 feet away. He had heard the last sentence. He had heard the word parasite. I saw his face change. The fear that had defined him all night, the fear of the debt, the fear of the lawsuit, the fear of losing his ability to walk, vanished. It was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Dominic took a step forward. He unclenched his fists. He started to move toward the table. His eyes locked on Gideon's back. He looked like a man who was about to tackle the host to the ground. Then he stopped. He stopped as if he had run into an invisible wall. He stopped because he remembered. He remembered the shell company. He remembered the 7 figures. He remembered that if he punched Gideon Vale, he wouldn't just go to jail. He would destroy my mother's life and my life. He stood there, vibrating with impotence, his chest heaving. He looked at me, and I saw a man breaking into pieces. Gideon did not see Dominic. He only saw me. He straightened up, satisfied. He thought he had won. He thought my silence was submission. He thought he had successfully put the other sister in her place and entertained his guests with a display of intellectual dominance. He turned back to the room, spreading his arms wide. You see, he told the crowd, switching back to English. It is a dead language for a reason. Some things are better left in the past, just like some people are better suited for the background. The room laughed again, louder this time, relieved that the tension was breaking, relieved that the victim had not fought back. Gideon looked back at me one last time. He winked, a slow, deliberate wink. Get another drink, Winna, he said dismissively. You look like you need it. He turned his back on me completely. He began to walk away, toward the center of the room, toward the applause that was beginning to ripple through the crowd. I looked at his back. I looked at the perfect tailoring of his tuxedo. I looked at my mother, who was weeping silently. I looked at Dominic, who was defeated. I looked at Maris, who was a prisoner, and then I looked at the notebook on the table. He had called me a parasite. He had called me a creature of surplus. He had used the language of the law to strip me of my humanity, but he had made a mistake, a grammatical mistake, a phonetic mistake, and a fatal strategic mistake. He had assumed that because I was silent, I was empty. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor. The sound was not loud, but it was distinct. I stood up. I did not pick up a glass. I did not pick up a weapon. I just stood there, in my beige dress, in the blind spot that was no longer blind. I took a breath. The air tasted of expensive perfume and rot. I waited 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I waited until the applause began to die down. I waited until Gideon was halfway to the cake. I waited until the silence began to stretch again, thin and brittle. Then, I opened my mouth. I allowed the silence to stretch. I let it pull tight across the room like a piano wire. Gideon was walking away from me, his back to table 19. His shoulders relaxed in the easy, fluid posture of a man who believes he has just delivered a knockout blow. The laughter of the crowd was beginning to thin out, dissipating into a few polite chuckles and the clinking of silverware, signaling that the entertainment was over and the audience was ready to return to their truffles. He had calculated everything perfectly. He had calculated my poverty. He had calculated my mother's fear. He had calculated the social pressure that would keep a poor relation quiet in a room full of billionaires. But he had miscalculated the one thing he had chosen to use as his weapon. He had walked into my house. He had walked into the 12th century, a place where I had lived for the last 10 years, and he had done it with the confidence of a tourist reading from a phrasebook. I stood up straight. I did not hold a glass. I did not hold a microphone. I simply projected my voice from the diaphragm, using the technique I had learned defending my thesis in a lecture hall in Lyon. The sound of the Anglo-Norman dialect cutting through the air was distinct. It was guttural, rhythmic, and infinitely heavier than the flowery, modern accented imitation Gideon had just performed. It did not sound like a parlor trick. It sounded like a sentencing. Gideon stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He froze mid-step. his tuxedo shoe hovering an inch above the carpet before slowly lowering to the floor. The crowd, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, fell silent. This was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of shock. I continued, keeping my voice level, stripped of all emotions save for the cool, clinical detachment of a professor correcting a particularly slow student. If you wish to speak the language of kings, you must know the difference between a sack of grain and a duty of honor. I saw the muscles in Gideon's neck tighten. He turned slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at me as if the furniture had suddenly begun to speak. I did not let him interrupt. I did not give him the space to recover his charm. I stepped out from behind the table, moving into the light. "You made a grammatical error in your first sentence," I said, switching to English. My voice was clear, carrying to the back of the room without effort. "You used the masculine article for burden. In the Angevin courts of the 12th century, a burden carried by a family member was a feminine noun. It implied a duty taken on willingly. By using the masculine, you implied a physical weight, like livestock or manure. You tried to insult me, but you only revealed that your understanding of the language comes from a textbook, not from the history you claim to revere." A gasp rippled through the room. It was soft, but audible. I saw Renee Hawthorne, the lawyer, lower her glass of water, her eyes wide behind her rimless glasses. Gideon's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He opened his mouth, likely to make a joke, to dismiss me as a pedant, but I cut him off. "And your pronunciation," I added, softening my voice just enough to make the guests lean in to hear. "You pronounce the word parasite with a modern Parisian R. It is soft, it is elegant, it is the accent of a modern café." I took a step closer to him. "But in Anglo-Norman, the R is hard, it is rolled, it is a sound made in the throat." I looked him dead in the eye, and I spoke the word again, properly this time. "Parasite." The sound rasped like a file against metal. "You sound like a tourist. Gideon," I said. "You sound like someone who bought the costume but cannot walk in the boots." The room was deathly quiet now. The waiters had stopped moving. The jazz band was motionless. The smile had vanished from Gideon's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked at the investors from Zurich. He looked at the politicians. He realized, with dawning horror, that they were not looking at him anymore. They were looking at the woman in the beige dress who had just dismantled his intellectual vanity in under 60 seconds. But I was not done. He had called me a parasite. He had called me a creature of surplus. He had used the language of the law to define my worthlessness. "You quoted the law of surplus," I said. "You called me sans terre, without land, but you forgot the second half of that maxim. It is a famous ruling from the Exchequer of Normandy. Circa 1180, I looked past Gideon, directly at Lucien Beaumont. The old man was sitting perfectly still, his wineglass resting on the table. His eyes locked on mine with an intensity that burned. I spoke the maxim in flawless, rapid-fire Anglo-Norman. I let the ancient words hang in the air for a heartbeat, allowing the harsh, rhythmic cadence to settle over the room like dust. Then I translated. "He who holds the land through debt is not a lord, but a serf to his creditor. The true parasite is he who eats at another man's table and calls it his own." Gideon went pale. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a curtain falling. He understood. He didn't speak the language fluently, but he knew enough. He heard the word debt. He heard the word creditor. He realized in that second that I wasn't just correcting his grammar. I was quoting his own financial structure back to him. I was telling him that I knew about the shell companies. I knew about the leverage. I knew that his ownership of my family, and perhaps his own empire, was built on paper he had bought, not wealth he had created. I saw his eyes dart to the side, checking the reaction of the French investors. I turned my head and addressed them directly. I looked at the table where Lucien Beaumont sat, and I switched to modern French. "Mr. Beaumont," I said, my voice smooth and professional. Please excuse this interruption, but it is important to clarify that in our family, we take the accuracy of terms very seriously. A bought debt is not a paid debt, and a man who uses silence to hide his obligations is not a reliable partner. Lucien Beaumont did not smile this time. He slowly nodded. It was a grave, singular nod of acknowledgement. He lifted his glass to me, a millimeter off the table. Gideon looked like he was about to be sick. His hands were clenched at his sides, trembling. He looked at Beaumont, then he looked back at me. The fear in his eyes was absolute. He wasn't afraid of embarrassment anymore. He was afraid of ruin. He realized that the invisible sister had been in the room during his phone call. Or worse, that she had deciphered the trail he thought was buried. I turned back to him. I was standing 5 feet away. The distance felt immense, yet intimate. You chose this language because you thought it was a code I couldn't break, I said in English, delivering the final line soft and low. You chose it to hide your cruelty in plain sight. I just took off the cover. I did not wait for him to respond. There was nothing he could say. If he argued, he looked defensive. If he screamed, he looked unstable. If he tried to laugh it off, he looked delusional. I had trapped him in his own stage play. I did not wait for applause. I did not look at my mother, who was staring at me with her mouth open, half in horror and half in awe. I did not look at Dominic, though I could feel his gaze on me like a physical touch. I simply turned around. I walked back to table 19. My heels did not click loudly. The carpet swallowed the sound. I moved with the economy of motion of a woman who has finished her work and is ready to go home. I sat down. I picked up my napkin and placed it back on my lap. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip. The room remained completely silent for another 5 seconds. It was a lifetime. It was the silence of a hierarchy collapsing. Then, someone coughed. A chair scraped. The spell broke, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The air was no longer filled with the easy arrogance of wealth. It was filled with the sharp, electric scent of danger. Gideon was still standing in the center of the room. He looked small. His tuxedo looked like a costume. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a stain on his vest. He saw the fire that was about to burn the vest off his back. I caught his eye over the rim of my water glass. I didn't blink. Your move, Gideon. I thought, but be careful. The next lesson is going to be much more expensive. The silence that I had orchestrated did not last. It shattered, not gradually, but instantly, like a glass hurled against a brick wall. Gideon Vale did not respond with wit. He did not respond with another quote from a dead language. He responded with the desperate, feral instinct of an animal that realizes the trap has clamped shut around its leg. "Security," he screamed. His voice cracked, stripping away the baritone polish he had cultivated for the cameras. "Get her out of here. Now." He pointed a shaking finger at me. His face was no longer pale. It was blotchy with rage, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. He turned frantically to the table of French investors, his eyes wide and manic. "Do not listen to her," he shouted, his hands waving in the air. "She is a fraud. She is a corporate spy. This is a setup." He spun back toward me, advancing until he was spitting distance from my face. "Who sent you?" he demanded. "Was it Sterling Hearth? Did they pay you to crash this dinner? You think I do not know. You work for that integrity bureau. You have been digging into my files. This is industrial espionage." He was improvising. It was a clumsy, frantic narrative, but in a room full of people who feared lawsuits more than God, it was a dangerous accusation. "She has been eavesdropping," Gideon yelled to the room. "She was lurking in the hallway earlier. She overheard confidential trade secrets regarding the Beaumont acquisition, and now she is trying to leverage them to sabotage the deal. This is criminal. I want her removed. I want her detained." 2 of the large security guards near the entrance began to move. They moved with the heavy, purposeful stride of men who are paid to stop asking questions and start removing problems. I did not move. I did not flinch. But my mother did. Lorraine Clearfield, who had spent the entire evening trying to blend into the upholstery, suddenly lunged at me. She grabbed my arm with both hands, her grip painful, her nails digging into my flesh through the silk of my sleeve. "Winna, stop," she begged. Her voice was a high, thin wail that cut through the tension. "Please, just apologize. Tell him you made it up. Tell him you are sorry." I looked down at her. Her face was wet with tears, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked pathetic. She looked terrified. "Mother, let go," I said quietly. "No," she sobbed, shaking me. "You do not understand. We will lose everything. The house, the pension, the reputation. If he calls the debt, Winna, please. We cannot afford your pride." The words hung in the air, naked and ugly. "We cannot afford your pride." It was the truth, finally spoken aloud. My mother did not care about the truth. She did not care that Gideon had called me a parasite. She did not care that he was using my sister as a broodmare for a business merger. She cared about the illusion of safety. She cared about the money that kept the wolves at the door. Even if the man holding the leash was a wolf himself, she was willing to sell my dignity to keep her comfort. I pulled my arm away from her. It took force. I had to physically pry her fingers off my skin. "I am not the one who needs to apologize." "Mother," I said, my voice cold, "and I am not the one who sold this family." The security guards were 10 feet away. Gideon was gesturing at them, his face a mask of triumph. He thought he had found the angle. If he could paint me as a criminal, as a spy, he could discredit everything I had just said. He could dismiss the truth as a tactic of corporate warfare. "Remove her," Gideon barked, "and take her phone. She has recorded confidential conversations." One of the guards reached for me. "That is enough." The voice did not come from me. It did not come from the investors. It came from the shadows near the service entrance. Renee Hawthorne stepped into the light. She moved with the lethal grace of a predator. She did not look at me. She looked at the security guards. She held up one hand, palm out, a gesture of absolute authority. "Stand down," she said. Her tone was bored, professional, and terrifyingly calm. The guards stopped. They looked at Gideon. They looked at Renee. They knew who signed the paychecks, but they also knew who signed the legal indemnification forms that kept them out of prison. "Renee, what are you doing?" Gideon snapped. "She is a liability. She is a spy. She is the sister of the bride." "Gideon," Renee said, walking slowly toward us. "And there are 80 witnesses in this room, including the senior partners of 3 international law firms and a United States senator. If you have security drag a woman out of her sister's engagement party because she corrected your grammar, the lawsuit for defamation and emotional distress will be filed before dessert is served." She adjusted her glasses, looking at Gideon with cold, dead eyes. "We do not make scenes. Gideon," she said, "we manage them, and you are making a scene." Gideon opened his mouth to argue, but the logic clamped his jaw shut. He looked around the room. He saw the phones. He saw the eyes. He saw that the narrative was slipping away from him. He glared at me with pure, distilled hatred. "Fine," he hissed. "Let her stay. But if she speaks another word of business..." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't have to. I stood there, my heart hammering. Renee had saved me, but she hadn't done it for me. She had done it to stop Gideon from imploding his own event. Then, I felt a presence at my shoulder. It was heat. It was the scent of laundry detergent and sawdust. I turned. Dominic was standing there. He was no longer the cowering figure in the hallway. He was no longer the man checking ventilation systems. He was standing tall, his shoulders squared, his hands loose at his sides. He looked tired, but the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a grim, heavy resolve. He stepped between me and Gideon. He put his back to the billionaire and looked at me. "Winna," he said. His voice was low, meant only for me. "Dominic," I whispered. "You need to step away. He will destroy you." "No," Dominic said. He shook his head. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small, metallic drive I had seen the security guard give him earlier. He held it tight in his fist. He can't destroy me. Winna. Because I have been waiting for this. I stared at him. What? The debt, Dominic said rapidly, his eyes locking onto mine. The medical bills. When he bought them, he made me sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. It said that if I ever spoke about the financial arrangement or the terms of the purchase, the debt would be called in immediately with interest. That is why I couldn't tell you. That is why I let you think we were just struggling. My chest tightened. He had been carrying this alone. For 3 years. He told me that if I stepped out of line, he would sue us into homelessness. Dominic continued. He made me his errand boy. He made me check his properties. He made me fix his mistakes. He glanced at Gideon over his shoulder, then back to me. But he made a mistake. Winna. He forgot that I am a project manager. I document everything. He opened his hand slightly, revealing the drive. Every time he asked me to do something illegal to maintain his properties, I logged it. Every time he made me bypass a safety code, I logged it. Every time he used a shell company to pay a bribe for a permit, I kept the email. I looked at the drive. It wasn't just data. It was a weapon. Dominic. I breathed. I didn't stand in the hallway because I was a coward. Dominic said, his voice breaking slightly. I stood there because I knew that if I made one wrong move, he would pull the trigger on us. I needed to make sure I had enough ammunition to shoot back. He looked at me with a vulnerability that broke my heart. I am sorry I let you feel alone. He said, but you are not alone. He turned around. He faced Gideon. Gideon was staring at Dominic with a mixture of confusion and contempt. What is this? Gideon sneered. The handyman wants to give a speech too. Dominic did not shout. He did not scream. He spoke with the flat, hard voice of a man who has measured the concrete and knows exactly how much weight the floor can hold. I am not your handyman. Gideon, Dominic said, and I am not your property. He held up the drive. You bought my debt, Dominic said, but you paid for it with fraud. I have 3 years of construction logs, permit violations, and safety bypasses on the downtown project. I have the emails where you instructed me to ignore the asbestos report. I have the wire transfer numbers for the inspectors you paid off. Gideon went still, statuesque still. That is protected information. Gideon whispered, you signed an NDA. An NDA covers trade secrets. Dominic said, it does not cover criminal negligence, and it certainly does not cover extortion. Dominic took a step forward. If you call the debt on my family, he said, I send this drive to the city inspector and the FBI. Tonight. The room was silent. This was not a grammatical correction. This was a nuclear standoff. Gideon looked at the drive, then at Dominic's face. He saw the truth. He saw that the man he had treated like a serf had been building a guillotine in the backyard the entire time. Suddenly, there was a movement near the cake. Maris, my sister, had been watching us. She had been watching the husband she thought was weak protect his wife. She had been watching the sister she thought was jealous fight for her dignity. And she had been watching the man she was about to marry threaten to destroy her family. She looked at Dominic, then she looked at me, and for the first time in years, the fog in her eyes cleared. She saw the cage. She saw the bars. She saw that the gold was just paint. She looked down at her left hand. The ring was massive. A 10-carat diamond that Gideon had picked out without asking her preference. It was heavy. It was a shackle. Maris did not cry. She did not scream. She reached down with her right hand and gripped the ring. Maris, Gideon warned, his voice low and dangerous. Do not do this. Maris pulled. The ring was tight, but she pulled until her knuckle turned white. With a sharp tug, it came free. She walked forward. She walked past Gideon. She walked to the table where we had been sitting, table 19. She placed the ring on the white tablecloth. It made a heavy, dull thud. I am not a commodity. Gideon, she said. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. Maris Gideon roared. He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. You ungrateful little think about what you are doing. You think you can walk away. I own you. I own your mother. I own the roof over your head. Maris flinched. But she did not pull away. She looked him in the eye. You own the debt, she said. You do not own us. Gideon lost it. The mask was gone. The billionaire was gone. There was only the bully, the tyrant who was watching his kingdom crumble because his subjects had stopped being afraid. I will ruin you, he screamed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I will call the loans tomorrow morning. I will sue your husband for breach of contract. I will make sure your sister never works in this city again. I will bury you in litigation so deep you will never see the sun. He turned to the room, his eyes wild. You hear me? He shouted at the stunned guests. No one hires them. No one touches them. They are dead in this town. He was panting, his chest heaving, his face twisted into a snarl of pure malice. He was terrifying. He was powerful. And he had the money to make every threat come true. My mother was sobbing openly now, slumped in her chair. Dominic stood his ground, but I could see the tension in his jaw. We had the truth, and we had the evidence, but Gideon had the billions. And in America, billions usually win. Gideon turned back to me, his lips curled in a sneer. You think you won, he spat. You think a little grammar lesson changes anything. I am the bank. Winna, and the bank always wins. I will take your house. I will take your car. I will take the shirt off your back. I looked at him. I looked at the hatred in his eyes. And then, from the center of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. It was a slow, deliberate sound. I looked over. At table 4, the silver-haired man was standing up. Lucien Beaumont rose to his full height. He buttoned his jacket with a slow, methodical calmness. He picked up his glass of wine. He did not look at Gideon. He looked at me. And then, he spoke. Stop. The word was not shouted. It was spoken with the quiet, absolute authority of a gavel striking mahogany. The security guard, whose hand was inches from my arm, froze. He did not look at Gideon. He looked past me, toward table 4. Lucien Beaumont had moved. He was no longer a spectator. He was walking toward the center of the room, his movements slow and deliberate, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He did not look at the security guards. He did not look at the trembling figure of my mother. He looked directly at Gideon Vale. Mr. Vale, Lucien said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who could crash a market with a whisper. I believe you are about to make a mistake that will cost you far more than a wedding. Gideon stared at him, his chest heaving. Lucien, what are you doing? This woman is a corporate spy. She is disrupting the event. No, Lucien said, coming to a stop between me and the guards. She is not a spy, and she is certainly not a hobbyist, as you so colorfully described her. Lucien turned to me. He offered me a small, respectful nod, the kind one general gives to another on the field. Clearfield is not merely an enthusiast of archaic legal syntax, Lucien continued, addressing the silent room. She is the primary architect of the linguistic integrity standards that my firm uses for all transatlantic contracts. Gideon blinked, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. I beg your pardon, Gideon stammered. The Hawthorne Ridge Integrity Bureau, Lucien said, pronouncing the name of my small, boring agency with reverence. It is not a basement operation. Gideon, it is the gold standard for contract validation. Ms. Clearfield's doctoral thesis on the binding nature of feudal obligation in Anglo-Norman law is not just a book on a shelf. It is the basis for the Beaumont Protocol. A gasp went through the room. The Beaumont Protocol was famous. It was the ironclad legal framework that made Lucien's deals unbreakable. Lucien turned back to Gideon, his eyes hard. You are attempting to sign a deal with me tonight. Gideon, a deal worth $400 million. And that deal relies entirely on the compliance structure that this woman wrote. He gestured to me. You are trying to buy a house, Lucien said coldly. While spitting in the face of the architect who built the foundation, you call her a parasite. She is the reason your contracts hold water. You call her a surplus creature. She is the only person in this room who understands the fine print you are too arrogant to read. Gideon looked at me. For the first time, he did not see the poor relation. He saw the professional. He saw the expert. And he saw the massive, gaping hole in his due diligence. He had been so busy checking my bank account that he had forgotten to check my bibliography. I did not know. Gideon whispered. It was the first time he had sounded small. Ignorance is not a defense. Gideon, Lucian said, it is a liability. Lucian reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded document. It was the term sheet, the deal, the reason for this entire charade. He held it up. I do not do business with men who do not know the source of their own authority, Lucien declared, and I certainly do not do business with men who use my language to abuse their family. He tore the paper in half. The sound of the ripping paper was louder than a gunshot. He tore it again, and again. He let the pieces flutter to the floor like confetti. The deal is dead, Lucian said. He turned to the table of French investors. Gentlemen, I am leaving. I suggest you do the same. The investors stood up immediately. They did not look at Gideon. They buttoned their jackets, finished their wine, and began to walk toward the exit. It was a mass exodus of capital. In the span of 30 seconds, Gideon had lost the deal, the backing, and the prestige he had spent 5 years cultivating. Gideon stood in the wreckage of his ambition. He looked at the torn paper on the floor. He looked at the retreating backs of the money men. No, he screamed. You cannot do this. We have a verbal agreement. There is no agreement. Renee Hawthorne's voice cut in. She stepped forward. Standing next to Lucian, she looked at her boss with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. The term sheet was conditional on tonight's closing. Renee said, Lucian just revoked the condition. It is over. Gideon, and she added, her voice dropping to a warning tone, I have logged every threat you made tonight. You threatened to ruin Ms. Clearfield's career. You threatened to call the loans on Mr. Coldbrook in retaliation for whistleblowing. That is extortion. That is witness intimidation. She looked at the guests who were still watching, frozen in their seats. If you proceed with any action against this family, Renee said, I will personally testify for them, and I will bring the entire compliance department with me. Gideon looked at her. Betrayed. You work for me. I work for the firm, Renee corrected, and you just became the firm's biggest liability. Gideon looked around wildly. He was cornered. He had no deal. He had no lawyer. He had no allies. But he still had the debt. He turned his venom on us, on the family he thought he owned. Get out, he shrieked, his face purple. Get out of my house. I will call the bank tomorrow. I will sell your debt to the worst collection agency in the city. I will strip you bare. Dominic stepped forward. He walked past me, past the stunned security guards, and stood toe-to-toe with Gideon. He was not shouting. He was deadly calm. He took the small metallic drive from his pocket and held it up. Do it, Dominic said softly. Call the bank. Gideon stared at the drive. Go ahead. Dominic challenged. Make the call. And the moment you hang up, I send this drive to the Inspector General. I have photos of the cracks in the foundation of the riverfront tower. I have the emails where you bribed the safety commissioner. I have the logs of the illegal dumping. Dominic leaned in. You own my medical debt. Fine, I own your freedom. You want to trade? Gideon froze. He looked at the drive. He knew what was on it. He knew that if that information got out, he wouldn't just lose money. He would go to federal prison. The leverage had shifted. The seesaw had slammed down on the other side. And Gideon was dangling in the air. Helpless. He swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed. He took a step back. You signed an NDA. Gideon rasped weakly. So sue me, Dominic said. We can discuss it in court. I am sure the jury will be very interested to hear why you bought a man's spine just to silence him. Gideon said nothing. He couldn't. He was checkmated. Dominic turned to me. He didn't smile, but his eyes were bright. He held out his hand. Let's go home. Winna. I took his hand. It was warm. It was steady. It was the hand of a partner, not a dependent. We turned to Maris. She was standing by the table. looking at the ring she had left on the cloth. She looked at Gideon one last time, not with fear, but with the cold indifference of a stranger. "Maris," I said. She looked at me. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in 3 years, her shoulders dropped. "I am coming," she said. We walked toward the exit, but there was one person left. My mother. Lorraine Clearfield was still sitting in her chair, staring at the empty space where her social standing used to be. She looked at Gideon, who was vibrating with impotent rage. She looked at the wealthy guests who were whispering behind their hands, and then she looked at us. Her 3 children, the daughter she had underestimated, the son-in-law she had pitied, and the daughter she had sold. "Mother," I said, "I did not beg. I did not plead. I just offered a choice. Are you coming?" Lorraine looked at Gideon. "You promised," she whispered to him. "You promised we would be safe." Gideon sneered at her. "You are nothing. Lorraine, you are a bankrupt widow with nothing to offer. Get out of my sight." Something snapped in my mother's face. The fear broke. She stood up. She picked up her clutch. She didn't look at Gideon again. She walked over to us, her head high, her sapphire necklace glittering under the lights. She took Maris's hand. "Let us go," she said. Her voice was shaky, but it was hers. We walked out. We walked past the silent jazz band. We walked past the stunned waiters. We walked past Lucien Beaumont, who raised his glass to me one last time as I passed. We walked out of the heavy oak doors of the Brackenwell house and into the humid Georgetown night. The air outside was heavy and hot, but it tasted sweet. It tasted like oxygen. Behind us, inside the mansion, I heard the sound of Gideon screaming at his staff. A high, frantic sound that faded as the heavy doors swung shut. We stood on the sidewalk. Dominic put his arm around my waist and pulled me close. He pressed his forehead against my temple. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry I didn't tell you." "It is okay," I said. I leaned into him. "We are out. We are free." Maris was crying now. Soft, healing tears, hugging our mother who was holding her like she was a little girl again. I looked back at the house. It looked like a fortress. But I knew the truth. It was just a house, and the man inside was just a man who had forgotten the grammar of power. Epilogue. 3 months later. The coffee in my cup was hot, and the view from my new office window was spectacular. It overlooked the inner harbor of Baltimore, the water sparkling under the morning sun. I adjusted the stack of files on my desk. The cover sheet read, "International Contract Validation Standards, Oversight Committee." The job offer had come a week after the party. It wasn't from Lucien Beaumont directly, but his recommendation had been the key. I was no longer an analyst in a basement. I was the director of linguistic compliance for a global trade organization. The pay was significant. Enough to pay the mortgage, enough to pay the bills, and enough to pay the lawyers. The legal battle with Gideon Vale was ongoing, but it was not the one-sided slaughter he had threatened. With Renee Hawthorne's testimony and Dominic's evidence, the district attorney had opened an investigation into Vale Meridian Partners. Gideon was fighting 5 separate lawsuits. His assets were frozen. His social calendar was empty. The debt, the medical debt that had hung over us like a sword, had been declared null and void by a judge who found the terms unconscionable and predatory. Dominic was working again, managing a legitimate project for a city that valued safety over speed. He walked with a lighter step these days. Maris was living with me for now. She was painting again. She had sold the engagement ring, which, legally, was a gift, and used the money to start a small gallery. She was healing. I picked up my pen, a nice one, a gift from Lucien, and signed the document in front of me. I thought about Gideon. I heard he was spending his days screaming at his remaining lawyers, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. He was still rich, technically, but he was alone. He was a man who had tried to buy a family and ended up with nothing but receipts. I capped my pen. He had tried to use language to erase me. He had tried to use words to make me small. I smiled. Don't use language to humiliate someone if you aren't ready to be answered by the truth in that exact language. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed seeing a billionaire get taken down by a grammar lesson, please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I love hearing from you guys from all over the world. Please invite your friends to subscribe to the Juliet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so we can keep bringing you more stories of justice served cold. See you in the next one.